The stress in the auto business has kicked way up over the last couple months. Another cyclical indication to add to broader concerns about the long-run health of the global economy. The latest comes from the ISM, and it was bad for December, second lowest since 2020. New orders that are crashing, shipments that are cratering. The entire industry is only now being forced to come to grips with far more overcapacity than had been previously hoped. And it's a microcosm of the entire economy, how there really was no recovery from the pandemic. Car makers all around the world had expected there would be, and even a robust one. And them finding out differently has only been delayed by the supply shock itself. Car sales were still relatively decent through last year, and for some even into this year. Stellantis' stock price, for example, that was at a record high as late as March. But it's been all downhill ever since then. Another signal that has shown a major shift in the global economy from around March and April. But now the damage is starting to spread out all over the world. Europe's manufacturers, they're a total mess. There are layoffs and even way too many workers for the amount of production in the United States. American demand for Japanese cars has absolutely plunged. So much that Nissan has gone begging to Honda for a Hail Mary merger to save it from possibly going completely broke, or at least more broke than it already is. And this isn't about electrification and the so-called slow adoption of electric vehicles. All that's just a euphemism for consumers don't want electric vehicles. And even if they did, they can't afford them or any other cars right now. As Volkswagen CEO admitted a couple months ago, quote, "The market is simply no longer there." That's also true for the entire global system and its alleged recovery. Overcapacity in the auto business is just a symbol of how the economy is simply no longer there. As a consequence, there's going to be more layoffs in autos and elsewhere. Central bankers, as I said this weekend, ending this year in a state of panic. Not that their rate cuts are going to be able to fix this. These are cyclical as well as structural warnings that we're getting from the auto business, a representation of the underlying fundamentals, which really are that we never recovered from the 2020 supply shock. That's what's really going on here, that businesses were expecting a recovery because everyone said there would be, businesses and autos more than anywhere. It was only the imbalance between supply and demand. During 2020 and 2021, demand came back faster than supply was able to service. And because of that, prices were the only way for that to adjust. So prices zoomed ahead, and it made it look like the economy was red hot. It looked like inflation to many people, when it was really just that simple economic imbalance. But companies and governments and people all over the world began to plan and act as if that was going to be a permanent plateau of prosperity. It wasn't. And that illusion started to become revealed in 2022, heading into 2023. But for the auto business, which this illusion was bigger than most, prices zoomed way ahead because of the inability for automakers to source supplies like chips, for example. Prices zoomed way ahead even though they weren't making nearly as many units as they had been before the pandemic. So they hired workers and they brought back facilities that ultimately they would not need because they are expecting over time that volume would go back up and come back up and recover to where prices and nominal levels had been. That's what we're finding out all over the world, is that it didn't work out that way. So now the auto business, like a whole lot of businesses around the world, is left with a tremendous amount of overcapacity. We've flipped everything around. Where there was too much demand, and even wasn't that much demand, there was too much demand for the inability of the system to supply it back a couple years ago. Now there's too much supply because everyone is expecting that demand would be maintained or at least recover in full. When we see in the labor market, the US in particular, it never even came close. We're millions and millions of jobs short of where we should have been had there been no pandemic. So with that amount of overcapacity, the industry, the auto industry, as well as the general global economy, they have to adjust to those fundamentals. There is a misalignment here. Too much supply, not enough demand, which means cutting back on supply. And that's what the ISM said today about December in the United States, at least that region of the U.S. economy. The ISM Chicago, or the business barometer there, that one plunged to 36.9 from 40.2 in November. So 36.9 here in December, when it had been about 46.6 back in September. This December reading is the lowest since May and the second lowest since 2020. The new orders index fell 13.5 points to its second lowest since May of 2020. And for the first time since 2020, more than half of the respondents in the survey said they're getting fewer new orders. So this is more widespread weakness than we've seen at any point since 2020. And the ISM Chicago was always sort of a loose proxy for the auto business in the United States. So when that was doing well, or at least not as poorly over the last several years, it suggests that maybe the auto business could come back from its pandemic lows. Maybe there was a way for a slow, drawn-out recovery. That's one thing that businesses and employers in particular have been holding out hope for. Even though there's this massive imbalance between actual demand and their ability to supply it, too much supply, not enough demand, overcapacity, holding out hope that demand would continue to grind higher and come back to the point that they wouldn't need to cut back on supply and wouldn't need to come back on capacity by closing factories and laying off workers. But the auto business is starting to come to grips with the fact that it's not going to end up that way. So we'll come back to the US in just a minute, but right now, Europe is ground zero for this realignment process, which is really nothing more than, I'll use the term recession. That's what a recession is, when you have too much supply over capacity and the entire economy is forced to adjust back to where it has a more stable equilibrium. Equilibrium is not the right term either. But Europe, as Volkswagen CEO had said a couple months ago, the market is simply no longer there. They're basically coming to terms with the fact that there is no recovery in autos. They're making a lot less autos, and that's not going to change. Even if the price went way up on individual cars, they don't sell as many cars, which means they don't need to make as many cars, which means they don't need as many workers nor factories. And so Volkswagen is basically at the absolute middle of this entire misalignment in the process to readjust, meaning they have to cut back on capacity because there's just no way for them. There's no way they need everything that they have. They don't need as many factories or workers. So just recently, Europe's top car maker, Volkswagen, agreed to a deal with unions on December 20th to cut 35,000 jobs and to reduce factory output by almost a quarter in Germany. Though there are no immediate plant closures or layoffs, those are going to come eventually. But Volkswagen did say earlier in December that its Audi plant in Brussels will cease production by February 28th after the company found no alternatives to that closure. And Volkswagen is just where it's most prevalent right now, but it's just the beginning, just the tip of the iceberg. Stellantis is another one. On November 26th, it announced plans to shut its Vauxhall van factory in Luton, England, putting more than 1,000 jobs at risk. And it has repeatedly halted assembly operations at its main plant in Italy's Mirafiori due to low demand, in particular for electric version of the Fiat 500. And it's not just car makers. It's going to spill over into down the supply chain into auto parts makers, manufacturers, shippers, retailers, wholesalers, the entire gambit. Bosch, who's the world's biggest auto parts supplier, announced plans to cut 5,500 jobs by 2032 in its cross-domain computer solutions and steering divisions, mostly at German sites, and will reduce work hours for some employees. That's what it said last month. Even though that's a longer-term layoff project, they're certainly not going to be hiring over the next little while, and those layoffs are going to hurt and happen along the way. Ford, U.S. automaker Ford, on November 20th said it was going to cut 4,000 jobs, primarily in Germany and Britain, which represented 14% of its entire workforce. And in a statement, the company said, the transformation is particularly intense in Europe, where automakers face significant competitive and economic headwinds, while also tackling a misalignment between carbon dioxide regulations and consumer demand for electrified vehicles. So governments have been pushing EVs, consumers don't really want them, automakers are forced to make investments, and then the rest of the car business, which is supposed to support this transition, isn't doing so because of overcapacity. Not just overcapacity in EVs, overcapacity everywhere. and not just in Europe. Before we get to the US and especially Japan, what's going on with Honda and Nissan, do want to remind you that Eurodollar University, we're still having our after Christmas New Year's sale for the next couple of days. You only got a couple of days left. And here's your chance to go deep into the money and macro world, where we talk about the US dollar, especially recently, but also the labor market, what's really happening, the curves, what's happening in US treasuries. We go deep into all of these topics in our deep dive analysis. And as part of that after Christmas New Year's sale, there's the best deal we have on the deep dive analysis, where you get that, you get Eurodollar University's AI, you get a membership in the daily briefing, but there's information on everything that we're offering for the Christmas sale at our website, eurodollar.university. So shifting gears from the really pathetic state of the European business to the United States. There have been layoffs here, and as we've seen in government data, including the BLS Establishment Survey, layoffs, there's been a total reverse in the behavior of employment in the auto business in the United States too. To start with, GM has laid off about 2,000 workers in 2 rounds starting in August and again in November. The company cited, again, cost cutting and changing market conditions being realizing overcapacity. Stellantis, not only are they struggling overseas, They've initiated plans to cut nearly 4,000 factory jobs here in the United States, and those factory cuts have become a contentious issue with the UAW, the big union in the U.S. for auto workers, who have accused the company of violating the recent contract by removing product commitments, especially where it came to the Jeep Cherokee, and have threatened to strike over the allegations, even though Stellantis itself maintains that it has the contractual right to do this based on market conditions. And there's really not an argument there, because the market conditions are not just facing Stellantis, they're facing everyone. So it's causing problems, labor strife, overcapacity, laying off workers, not investing in new facilities. You don't need new facilities. So it's a broader economic problem than just not being able to sell a few more cars, or not being able to sell as many cars as they were doing a couple years ago before the pandemic. Even Tesla, earlier this year, around April, announced that they were cutting about 10% of its workforce. And they ended up cutting around 15,000 workers. And behind all of this, like I said before, no one is going to be hiring. And the worst part of all of that is as these layoffs happen and these good paying jobs disappear, there is no place for these auto workers to go. With the lack of hiring, lack of opportunities, basically it's 26 weeks of unemployment insurance aid and then nothing. So this is the worst part, and it adds into all of the recession and cyclical problems that we're experiencing Europe, the US, and even Japan. Even going by the US Establishment Survey, the number of auto workers, according to the BLS, there were 1.08 million as of July 2024, even though the Federal Reserve and its industrial production estimates showed that domestic motor vehicle assemblies totaled, well, it was 9.2 million seasonally adjusted annual rate in July, same month, but that had been the 6-month average up until the latest data, which is November, around 10.3 million. So 10.3 million domestic motor vehicle assemblies for about 1.08 million workers. But that compared to just 1.01 million workers in February of 2019 at the last cycle peak, back when the 6-month average for motor vehicle assemblies was 11.4 million. So you can see what happened here. Even in the United States, there were 7% more workers in July compared to February of 2019, even though they were producing 10% fewer units on average. Making fewer cars with more workers means that's fine as long as the price illusion is happening and nominal prices are still growing, which means that revenues are still growing. But as soon as the nominal part of it slows down, managers look at the amount of production that they're actually producing, 10% fewer cars, and they say, why do we have 7% more workers? Well, they don't have 7% more workers for very long. In many ways, Japan has it much worse because the auto business in Japan is not as big as it used to be. Certainly used to dominate Japan Inc., but it's still an important part of the Japanese economy. And Nissan is like Stellantis or Volkswagen, the most visibly troubled company there is. They already announced that they were cutting 9,000 jobs last month. and said they were going to reduce manufacturing output by about 20%. So 1/5 of their entire global production, they said, we're going to cut it back because of overcapacity. As a result, Nissan has been looking for solutions to what are really big problems. And just recently, suddenly there was an announcement that Honda and Nissan, along with Mitsubishi to an extent, were exploring ways in which they could possibly combine. And even as that was being announced, Honda's CEO reportedly had enormous difficulties in articulating why Honda would even want to get involved with Nissan. Honda's CEO just had a pretty awkward press moment related to its potential merger with Nissan. When asked why Nissan would make a good business partner for the mid-sized automaker, Honda's CEO struggled to find the right words before blurting out something that brought laughter to a room full of journalists. "That's a difficult one," he said. And the reason why they're merging is likely because of government pressure. The article continues, rumors have it that Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry helped to influence the deal to avoid Foxconn's takeover of Nissan after METI, which is the ministry, endorsed the merger. Assuming the merger does go through between Honda and Nissan for basically non-economic reasons, what that will mean is Nissan's going to get it. In other words, there's going to have to be a massive amount of cost savings because of all the redundancies that would be created. And really, this is just nothing more than a tactic to eliminate Nissan and to a fair amount Honda's overcapacity. One of the reasons what's brought urgency to all of these things is that not only overcapacity, but demand that wasn't there to begin with. There wasn't a recovery. Again, the cyclical part of this, demand is falling off. From Japan's perspective, and the most recent trade data that they just reported, as well as industrial production and the production of motor vehicles, show pretty grim results. According to Japan's industrial production, after the Toyota scandal Daihatsu earlier in January, production that sank after they closed down everything with Daihatsu, but it never came back in Japan anyway. So average output in the latter 6 months of 2024 is down 8% compared to the final 6 months of 2023. So output went down and never came back, even after the scandal was over with, and even after Daihatsu production was brought back online. And one of the reasons is that exports just aren't there. Export global demand for Japanese autos. Despite the fact the yen has been much weaker this year. Exports to the world of motor vehicles from Japan are down 3.8% year over year, and that's unit volume. In terms of values, down 5.2% year over year. These are the month of November. And exports specifically to the United States, down 16.9% in unit sales year over year. 16.9%, a huge drop in demand for Japanese cars. Massive overcapacity because the industry never recovered, on top of now cyclical downturn, which just adds more misery to a miserable situation. It's not just one thing or another, it's all of it. It's overcapacity because of lack of recovery. Everyone was expecting the economy to come back after the last couple of years because it looked like it was going to. But then it took a wrong turn in 2022. It's slowly over time, everyone in it, but most of all automakers, are realizing they have way too much productive capacity for the limited recovery from 2020 and 2021. That much overcapacity means recessionary processes. Recessionary processes for individual automakers as individual businesses, for industries, and the global economy as a whole. Quite simply, if you make less stuff, you don't need as many workers to make less stuff. And if you were hiring expecting to make more stuff and then that never happened, you have to get rid of the workers that you planned on using when you were thinking that the economy was actually recovering. So the auto business is still going through this misalignment transition, not to electric vehicles, but to the fact that, as Volkswagen CEO said, the market is simply no longer there. And it is, as I said in the introduction, a microcosm of the entire global system. The economy is simply no longer there. Everything that we just went over explains why the US dollar was this year's big surprise. I went over that in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. Check out our Christmas sale. A couple more days left of that. And until next time, take care.